When the police showed up at the door saying she had to leave because the house was no longer hers, it felt like the ground disappeared beneath her feet. But what do you mean? I didn't sell my house, said Natalie, her voice trembling. Sorry, ma'am, but the document is signed by you. The house was sold, replied the officer, not knowing what else to say, seeing the despair on her face. With no one to turn to, Natalie was forced to leave her home. Her daughters were not around to help her. They had abandoned her. She was left alone with no place to go, not understanding how everything had gone so wrong. Oliver, Natalie's husband, had received a job offer in another country, something temporary, which was supposed to last 3 months. He and Natalie talked a lot before making the decision. It'll be quick, love. 3 months will fly by and then I'll be back home. It'll be good. We'll be able to renovate the house and make it just the way we always dreamed of, he said, with that confident smile that always comforted her. Even with a heavy heart, Natalie trusted Oliver. He was a hard-working man and had always taken care of her and their family. So she agreed, and so Oliver left, promising to send money every month for the renovations. In the first few months, everything went well. Oliver kept his promise, sending good amounts. Natalie used the money to fix up the house, replacing the roof, painting the walls, making the place more comfortable. It was slow work, but she was happy. Besides the money for the repairs, Oliver also asked her to save some so they would have a good reserve when he returned. But by the end of the 3rd month, something changed. He didn't come back home and the money stopped coming. At first, Natalie thought it might be a delay, some issue with the bank or the transfer. She tried not to worry and waited, but the days passed and still nothing. Oliver's phone was no longer working and the messages she sent went unanswered. She started to worry for real. Could something have happened? She said to herself, pacing around the house. She tried every way to get in touch, but it was as if Oliver had disappeared. Her daughters, who until then had been living well off the money their father was sending, also began to feel anxious. The comfort they were used to started to fade. "Mum, what happened to Dad? Why isn't he sending money anymore?" they asked, mixing worry with impatience. Natalie didn't know what to say. She was in the dark too. Time passed, and that anxiety grew inside her. Oliver's absence felt like a huge emptiness. The house, which had been getting renovated so carefully, now seemed stuck in time, unfinished, just like their future. As the months went by, Natalie's daughters started to feel the impact of the missing money Oliver used to send. They were used to a good life, full of comforts they had never needed to worry about keeping before. But now, with the money gone and no news from their dad, things began to change. "Mum, how are we going to keep paying the bills?" asked Victoria, the adopted daughter, one day, throwing her phone on the table. "The house renovations have stopped, and we can't keep living like this, not knowing what's going to happen." Natalie looked at her daughters, feeling the weight of their concern. She didn't have answers. All she could do was try to stay calm and believe that Oliver would return. "We just need to be patient. Your dad will give us news. He's never let us down." But the daughters didn't share the same confidence. They were impatient, irritated by the uncertainty. Without the money they were used to receiving, they began to think that maybe Oliver would never come back. Maybe he had abandoned the family. And in their minds, if that was true, they couldn't keep relying on their mother, who, in their eyes, could no longer provide the luxurious life they had been living. That's when they had an idea, a cruel and desperate idea. They knew that the family house was the only valuable asset left, and with it, they could solve their financial problems for a long time. "If we sell the house, we can start over. It'll be better for everyone," said Victoria, trying to convince Eleanor, Natalie's biological daughter. "But what about Mum? Isn't she the most important person here?" asked Eleanor. "She'd never agree to sell the house. It's where we grew up. I'd never support this. Are you crazy, Victoria?" Victoria shook her head. "She doesn't need to know. We'll get her to sign the papers like it's something else, and that's it. She won't even notice. Then we can use the money to live better." So, after much discussion between the two, one day, Victoria came to Natalie with a pile of documents. "Mum, you need to sign here. They're just some papers for the renovation, nothing important," Victoria said, with a smile that tried to look innocent. Natalie, not suspecting anything, took the pen and signed. She trusted her daughter, believed they were trying to help. She didn't read the papers, didn't ask for details. She never imagined that with that simple gesture, she was giving up her home. Days passed, and Natalie noticed something was wrong. Her daughter's behavior changed. They started going out more, becoming more distant, but she didn't mind. She thought it was because of their father's absence. One day, which seemed like any other, Natalie was at home trying to adapt to her new routine. Suddenly the doorbell rang. Natalie went to the door, opening it with some difficulty. Outside stood two well-dressed men and a policeman beside them. She frowned, not understanding what was happening. "Can I help you?" she asked, trying to hide her nervousness. "Mrs. Natalie?" one of the men asked, holding a folder full of documents. "Yes, that's me. What's going on?" The policeman, with a serious expression, stepped forward. "We've received an order. You need to vacate the house. These men are the new owners." Natalie was in shock. "What? How? This is my house. I've lived here for years. There must be a mistake." One of the men opened the folder and showed her the papers. "No, ma'am. The house was sold some time ago. Here is the sale contract, signed by you." Natalie's heart raced. She took the papers with trembling hands and saw her signature there. How was this possible? Suddenly everything made sense. Her daughter, she had tricked her, made her sign those papers without knowing she was selling her own house. "But I didn't know I was selling my house," Natalie said, desperate, looking at the policeman. "My daughters, they tricked me." The policeman sighed, but his expression remained firm. "I understand this is difficult, ma'am, but the process is done. You have to leave the house." Natalie was paralyzed for a moment, unable to believe what she was hearing. She looked around at the walls that had witnessed so many memories, so much laughter, so many joyful moments with her family. And now all of that was being taken away from her. "You can't do this to me," she said, her voice breaking with pain. "I've lived here my whole life, my husband, my daughters. This house is all I have." One of the men looked at her with a slightly embarrassed expression but replied, "I'm sorry, ma'am, but the new owners have legal rights. You have to leave today." With nowhere to go, Natalie was evicted. The policeman and the men stood by the door, waiting as she gathered what she could in a small suitcase. With a heavy heart, she left the house, feeling more lost than ever. It was hard to believe this was happening. Now, without a home, without money, and betrayed by her own daughters, Natalie was completely alone in the world. Natalie walked through the streets with no clear destination. The wind was cold, and her hands trembled as she tried to warm herself somehow. She felt a weight in her chest, deep regret and sadness. How had her life come to this? She was a 70-year-old woman who should be surrounded by her family, but instead she was alone, without a home, without support. She stopped at a park, sat on a bench and sighed. "Where did I go wrong?" she murmured to herself. Silence was her only answer. Natalie never imagined she would be manipulated by her own daughters. They, whom she loved and protected so much, had tricked her, taken her home, her security. And Henry just disappeared. She trusted him, believed he would return, but he vanished when she needed him most. The cold night was setting in, and Natalie pulled her old coat tighter to try and keep warm. People passed by her, but no one looked her way. She was just another forgotten person on the streets. In the silence, she closed her eyes and let the tears fall. Did Henry know what our daughters were doing? She thought. Maybe he had disappeared because he knew everything was falling apart. Or maybe not. Maybe he was somewhere, with no idea what was happening to her. What hurt the most was not knowing. The reality of living on the streets was cruel. There was no place to sleep, no guarantee of food. The constant fear of not knowing what the next day would bring was always with her. "I never thought it would end up like this," she whispered, her eyes filled with pain. Eleanor always lived a simpler life than her sister Victoria. She never cared much about luxury or parties. She worked as a teacher in a small school and lived in a modest apartment, far from all the hustle that her family seemed to be caught up in. She woke up early every day, made her coffee, read a bit before going to work, and led a quiet routine. But even living this simple life, Eleanor had something that bothered her deeply: her mother's situation. Eleanor knew things weren't going well for Natalie. She knew her sister had convinced their mother to sign documents without understanding, and that the house had been sold. She knew Natalie was suffering, but even with all this information, she chose to stay distant. It was easier for her not to think too much about it. Mum has always been strong. She'll figure it out. I have my own life too, she said to herself while washing the dishes or organizing school materials. Eleanor convinced herself that everything was fine, that it wasn't her responsibility to solve problems caused by others. But in some quiet moments, the guilt started to creep in. When she was alone in her apartment without the rush of work to distract her, Eleanor found herself thinking about her mother. She imagined how Natalie was living, whether she was okay or needed help. And even though she tried to push those thoughts away, they always came back. I should call her, or at least look for her, she murmured to herself, looking at the phone, but she never did. Something always stopped her. Maybe it was the fear of facing the truth, of finding out her mother's situation was worse than she thought. Or maybe it was because Eleanor had learned to protect herself, to put up a barrier between herself and other people's suffering. Her simple life was a choice, but it was also an escape. Far from her mother and family problems, she felt safer, as if she had built a bubble where nothing bad could touch her. But deep down, Eleanor knew she couldn't ignore reality forever. The image of her mother, alone and abandoned, appeared in her thoughts more and more often, bringing a discomfort she tried to ignore, but that kept growing. Victoria lived in a completely different world from her sister Eleanor. While Eleanor preferred a simple life, Victoria dove headfirst into a luxurious and fast-paced lifestyle. For her, the most important thing was always being at the most popular parties, surrounded by influential people, and staying updated on the latest fashion and technology trends. Any free time she had was spent either partying or in front of the computer, following the cryptocurrency market, where she had invested a large part of her money. I'm going to get really rich with this, she would say, while analyzing complicated charts on the screen. The glow of the city lights came through the large windows of her luxury apartment, where she lived, far from her family. The place was modern, full of expensive furniture but empty of any warmth. For Victoria, the important thing was to keep making money and maintain the life of luxury she had achieved. With so much going on around her, Victoria had no time or patience to think about her mother's situation or her relationship with her sister. When Natalie was evicted from her house, Victoria didn't care. In fact, she didn't even bother to speak to her mother. To her, her mother's problems were just a distant inconvenience, something not worth her attention. Mum's old. She'll manage somehow. And Eleanor's the responsible one. She must be handling it, she thought, always finding an excuse not to get involved. She was too busy with her own concerns, like cryptocurrencies, which were rising and falling in value every moment, and the parties she couldn't miss. Victoria's days were always busy and distracting. She woke up late, had a quick coffee, and soon sat in front of the computer, focused on her investments. In the afternoon, she would go out to meet friends and business partners, and at night, she was at some party where she always had to keep up appearances and be seen in the best places. If anyone asked about her mother, Victoria gave quick and cold answers. She's fine, she'd say, without really knowing. For her, the most important thing was to make sure her life continued as it was, full of luxury, fun, and new opportunities to make money. But behind all the bright and busy life, there was an emptiness that Victoria refused to see. Deep down, she knew she was neglecting her mother and sister, but she didn't want to deal with it. She preferred to keep distracting herself with parties and quick profits, believing that as long as she was doing well, the rest didn't matter as much. One day, unexpectedly, Henry finally returned after a year of being missing. He stepped off the bus, tired but relieved to be back in his city. The familiar air made him take a deep breath, feeling that despite everything he had been through, he was where he was supposed to be. The time he had been away felt like an eternity. The journey had been full of hardships, but now all he wanted was to return home, embrace Natalie, and tell her everything that had happened. He started walking through the streets, eager to see his house, the place where he had lived so many happy moments with his wife. But as he turned the corner, something strange made him stop. The house was no longer there. What he saw was a different facade, strangers in the yard and the name on the mailbox, and wasn't his. But what happened? He murmured to himself, confused. He approached the house, almost unable to believe what he was seeing. He knocked on the door, and a man he had never seen before opened it. "Sorry, are you looking for someone?" the man asked with a curious expression. My wife, Natalie, she lived here. I'm Henry, the owner of this house," he said, his voice trembling with surprise. The man frowned, not understanding. "Sir, this house was sold months ago. The previous owner had to leave, I think, because of financial problems. I don't know anything else. I'm sorry." Henry's heart raced. He didn't know what to think. How could the house where he and Natalie had lived for so many years no longer be theirs? And where was Natalie? Desperate, Henry began walking through the streets, asking the neighbors, but no one could say for sure what had happened to her. She was evicted. And the daughters? Didn't they help her? Henry asked, full of worry. Some neighbors exchanged glances, unsure of what to say. One of them, an older woman, approached with a sad look. "Henry, I'm so sorry. I haven't seen Natalie around here for a while. I heard she was left without a home, abandoned. The daughters didn't do much. And after that, no one knew where she went." Henry stood still for a moment. His mind was trying to process everything at once. The pain in his chest was intense. How could this have happened? He knew he had been away for a long time, but he never imagined something so serious could happen while he was gone. "I need to find my wife," he said. Without wasting any more time, he began searching for Natalie. Henry searched for Natalie everywhere he could think of. He asked neighbors, walked through the streets, went to the shops she used to visit, but no one knew exactly where she was. With every passing hour, his anxiety grew. He couldn't believe that his beloved wife was missing, with no one to take care of her. Then, almost without hope, he decided to go to the park where they used to walk when they were younger. It was a peaceful place where they spent hours talking, laughing, and making plans for the future. As he entered the park, his heart raced. He looked around, searching for any sign of Natalie. And then he saw her. Sitting on a bench with slumped shoulders and a weary face was Natalie. She looked so different, so fragile. Her clothes were worn, her hair messy, and her gaze lost. Henry's heart tightened, seeing her like that. It was as if the weight of the world had fallen on her. "Natalie," he called, his voice thick with emotion. She slowly raised her eyes, unable to believe what she was seeing. "Henry, is it you?" she asked in a soft, weak voice. He ran to her, kneeling beside the bench and holding her hands. "Yes, it's me, my love. I'm back. I'm so sorry it took so long. I'm sorry for everything." Natalie began to cry, silent tears running down her tired face. "I thought you'd never come back. It's been so hard. They sold our house, Henry. I've lost everything." Henry held her tightly, feeling how weak she was. "I know I found out, but now I'm here. I'll take care of you just like I always did." She looked at him, still not fully understanding what had happened. "Why did you disappear? Why didn't you let me know? I waited for so long." Henry sighed, his voice trembling as he began to explain. "I went on that mission that was supposed to last 3 months, remember? But things got out of control. During a trip through the mountains, we got caught in a terrible snowstorm. I was trapped there, with no way to communicate or return. I spent months waiting for help, with no way to send news. I thought I'd never come back." Natalie's eyes filled with concern. "Months? Henry, I didn't know. I thought you'd abandoned me." He quickly shook his head. "Never, Natalie. I'd never do that to you. I was there alone, almost dying while waiting for help. When they finally found me, I was taken to a hospital and stayed there for more than 20 days, recovering. Only then was I able to come back." She listened, still processing everything he was saying. It was hard to believe all this had happened. "I was alone, Henry. They tricked me. They made me sign papers and I lost our house." Henry pulled her closer. "I know, my love. But now you're not alone anymore. I'll do everything to fix this. I'll take care of you and give you everything you deserve." Eleanor was in her small apartment when she received the news that her father had returned. She stood still for a few minutes, trying to understand what that meant. Her heart raced, and a whirlwind of emotions overwhelmed her. She felt immense relief, as if a heavy burden was being lifted from her shoulders. Her father was back. He had found Natalie, her mother, and somehow, maybe things could go back to normal. But at the same time, guilt hit her hard. Eleanor knew she hadn't done enough to help her mother. During all that time, while Natalie was left with nothing, she had distanced herself, choosing to protect herself and not get involved in the family's problems. Now, with Henry back, the truth could no longer be ignored. She began pacing around the apartment, her mind racing. "What have I done?" she murmured to herself, feeling the weight of guilt pressing on her chest. She knew she should have done more, should have stood by her mother, but instead she had chosen the easier path, ignoring it. When she heard that Henry was looking into the house sale, her stomach turned. He was a fair man, always seeking the truth, and she knew that sooner or later he would find out everything, that the sale of the house was full of deception. Eleanor hadn't been directly involved, but she knew all about it, and she had done nothing to stop it. A lump formed in her throat. "I should have talked to him sooner. I should have done something," she repeated to herself, staring out the window, not really seeing what was outside. But now what was done was done. The guilt of staying silent was like a constant shadow in her mind. At the same time, her father's return brought a sense of hope. Maybe he could fix everything, undo the mistakes that had been made, give her mother the support she needed. Eleanor knew her father was the only person capable of doing that. He had always been a strong man, fighting for what was right, and now he was by Natalie's side. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her thoughts. "I need to go to them. I need to see my mother," she said out loud, as if it were a decision she should have made a long time ago. Eleanor knew that facing her father and mother now would be difficult, but she could no longer run away. She could no longer hide behind the distance she had created. Henry was sitting next to Natalie in the small room he had found for her, trying to comfort her after everything she had been through. But there were still many questions that haunted him. He couldn't understand how things had gotten so bad. His wife, the woman he loved so much, had been left with nothing, abandoned while he was away. He needed to know how this had happened. During one of his investigations, Henry discovered something that shook him to his core. Speaking with old family acquaintances, he learned that after selling the house, Victoria had decided to put Natalie in a care home. Victoria, always focused on her own life, thought this would solve the problem. She didn't want to deal with her mother, and putting Natalie in a home seemed like a practical solution to her. When Henry heard this, he was furious. How could she do that to her own mother? But what shocked him even more was discovering that Victoria had simply abandoned her. She left her mother there without any care for what would happen next. Henry clenched his fists, struggling to stay calm. And no one did anything. Didn't anyone try to help? Natalie, who had always cared for everyone, had been left without anyone to help her. Victoria had abandoned her, and Eleanor, who had always been closer, did nothing to change the situation. She knew what was happening but chose to distance herself, leaving their mother to face everything alone. Henry returned to Natalie, still trying to process everything. He looked at her, sitting on the bed, her face tired but relieved to have him back. "Natalie," he said, "I found out what they did to you. I'm so sorry I wasn't here earlier. Victoria put you out on the street and just left you there. You were kicked out." Natalie lowered her head, a tear sliding down her face. "I tried, Henry. I tried to understand what was happening, but I was alone. They didn't care about me." Henry took her hand, gently squeezing it. "I'm here now. I'll never let this happen to you again. We're going to fix this. They'll have to answer for what they did." A few days later, Henry began investigating more deeply into what had happened with the sale of the house and the family's finances. The more he dug, the more strange things he uncovered. One day, while going through old family documents, he found something that caught his attention, an old envelope which seemed to have been kept for many years. It was something he had never seen before. Curious, Henry opened the envelope and found a letter written by his father, who had passed away years ago, which had been stored without being opened. The letter was addressed to Eleanor, Henry, and Natalie's biological daughter. The tone of the letter was serious but full of affection. In it, Eleanor's grandfather mentioned an inheritance that had been left exclusively for her, something she could claim after turning 18. "Dear Eleanor, I know you've always been a fair and kind-hearted girl. That's why I'm leaving you something special that I saved during my life. This inheritance is yours, a gift I believe you'll use wisely. I never wanted this money to interfere with family relationships, so I kept it a secret until now. When the right time comes, I hope you use it well." Henry was stunned. He knew his father had left some savings, but he had no idea about this exclusive inheritance for Eleanor. And the most surprising part, Victoria, the adopted daughter, had no idea about the inheritance. She had always been the most interested in money and possessions, and now Henry understood why his father had kept this inheritance a secret during his life. He wanted to protect Eleanor and ensure she received something that was solely hers, free from any influence or manipulation. With the letter in hand, Henry went to Natalie, who was resting on the sofa. "Natalie, I found something important," he said, handing her the letter to read. She carefully took the letter, reading each word slowly, and when she finished, she looked at Henry with wide eyes. "So your father left this inheritance just for Eleanor?" Natalie asked, still processing the information. "Yes, it seems he did this in secret, to make sure Eleanor had something safe, without Victoria knowing," Henry replied seriously. Natalie sighed. "That explains so much. Victoria has always been obsessed with money. If she knew about this, she would have done anything to get her hands on that inheritance too." Henry nodded, knowing that this revelation could bring even more complications. They now had to decide how to tell Eleanor about the inheritance, and more importantly, how to protect what was rightfully hers, since Victoria would surely try to claim part of it if she found out. "We need to tell Eleanor, but carefully," said Henry, "and make sure she knows this money is hers and was left with love by her grandfather. We can't let Victoria interfere in this." Natalie nodded in agreement. "Eleanor deserves to know the truth, and she deserves to keep what's hers. Now that things are starting to come together, maybe this will help bring our family back together in some way." The next day, Natalie was sitting in a chair near the window, watching the sunset. Ever since Henry had returned, he had been taking care of her with all the love he always showed. He never abandoned her, despite everything that had happened. And now that he was back, Natalie felt he was the only person who had truly always been by her side. She took a deep breath and called Henry, who was in the living room organizing some papers. "Henry, can we talk?" she said, her voice soft but firm. Henry came over, sitting next to her, looking concerned. "Of course, Natalie. What is it?" She held his hand, squeezing it lightly as if gathering strength to reveal something she had kept inside for a long time. "I need to tell you the truth about what happened with the house, about the girls." Henry looked at her, his eyes full of attention. "I already know they made you sign those papers without explaining, but there's more, isn't there?" Natalie lowered her head for a moment, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "Yes, there is. Victoria manipulated me. She knew I didn't understand everything that was happening. She made me believe it was something simple, that I was just signing papers for the renovation, but what she wanted was the money from the house. I trusted her, Henry's, because she's my daughter, and I was wrong." Henry took a deep breath, trying to control the anger building inside him. He had always known something was wrong, but hearing Natalie confirm it hurt more than he expected. "Eleanor too?" he asked, surprised, as he had always thought Eleanor was different. Natalie shook her head slowly. "Eleanor, she wasn't like Victoria. She didn't intend to hurt me. But she stayed silent, Henry. She knew what was happening and chose to do nothing. I could see in her face that she wanted to speak, that she was sorry, but she never took action. She distanced herself from me, hid from the problem, and that hurt almost as much as what Victoria did." Henry looked at Natalie with sadness, feeling the weight of everything she had endured. "You never deserved this, Natalie. You were always the most dedicated mother. How could they do this to you?" Tears were now running down Natalie's face, and she wiped her eyes with her hands. "I don't know, Henry. I ask myself that every day, but what I do know for sure is that you've always been the only one who truly loved me. The only one who never lied to me, never left me helpless. Even when you were far away, I knew that if you could, you would be here." Henry held her hands tightly, looking into Natalie's eyes. "I'm here now, and I'll take care of you always. We won't let them destroy us anymore." Natalie paused, feeling the relief of finally saying what she had kept inside. "I needed to tell you this, Henry. I needed you to know the whole truth." Henry sighed deeply and with a soft voice said, "We'll sort this out together, Natalie. Now, we'll protect what's left of our family, and the girls, they'll have to face the consequences of what they've done." A few days later, Henry was sitting in the living room when he heard the door knock. He went over and, to his surprise, found Victoria standing at the entrance. She was well dressed, as always, but there was something in her eyes. It was clear that something was bothering her. He hadn't seen her since he discovered everything she had done to Natalie. "Dad, I need to talk to you," Victoria said, trying to keep her voice calm, but there was obvious tension in her words. Henry crossed his arms, his face serious. "What do you want, Victoria? After everything you've done, I don't know what you could possibly say to me. I'm very angry." She took a deep breath and walked in without being invited, as if she still had some right to be there. She sat on the sofa and looked at him, trying to maintain a confident posture. "I know things have been complicated, but I've been thinking. I found out about Eleanor and the inheritance. I'm your daughter too, and I think it's only fair that I get a share." Henry felt a wave of anger rise but kept his control. "Are you joking with me? After everything you did to your mother, you still have the nerve to come here and talk about inheritance?" Victoria raised her hands, trying to defend herself. "Dad, I made mistakes, I know. But I'm also your daughter. You can't just exclude me. I grew up with you. I know Natalie always loved me like a daughter, and I know you feel the same." Henry took a step forward, his face now serious and full of pain and anger. "Victoria, what you did is unforgivable. You manipulated your mother, the woman who took you in as her daughter, who gave you love and never treated you differently. You threw her out on the street and abandoned her when she needed you most, and now you come asking for inheritance." Victoria tried to stay calm, but her voice wavered slightly. "I know I made mistakes, but things weren't easy for me either. I was just trying to solve things my way. I thought you'd understand." "Understand? You have no idea what you're talking about. You're out of your mind," Henry replied, his voice firm and full of indignation. "I'm going to disinherit you, Victoria. You don't deserve the love your mother gave you. You don't deserve anything from this family." Victoria's eyes widened, surprised, and for the first time she seemed to truly understand the seriousness of the situation. "Disinherit? Dad, you can't be serious." "I'm more serious than ever," Henry responded, his eyes fixed on hers. "You don't deserve the trust you've broken, and I won't let you get your hands on anything from your mother or Eleanor. You've already caused enough damage." Victoria was silent for a few moments, seeming to process what he had just said. The arrogance she used to show was now replaced by fear. "But I'm part of this family. You can't just cut me off like that." Henry looked at her with deep sadness. "You chose to cut yourself off, Victoria, with your actions. Inheritance isn't something you get just because of blood. It's something that comes with respect and care for your family. And you failed at that. You betrayed us." She tried to argue, but the words didn't come out. Realizing there was nothing more she could do, Victoria stood up, looked at her father one last time, and without saying another word, left the house, slamming the door behind her. Henry stood still, looking at the door for a few seconds, feeling the weight of the decision he had just made. He knew he had done the right thing, no matter how painful it was. Victoria had chosen her own path, and now she would have to face the consequences. He went back to the room where Natalie was resting and sat next to her. Holding her hand, he said softly, "She doesn't deserve anything, Natalie. You gave me the greatest gift by trusting me, and I won't let her destroy what we have." At the end of another day full of emotions, Natalie sat on the sofa, trying to process everything that had happened. The conversation with Victoria still echoed in her mind, and the stress of the whole situation seemed to be weighing on her more than ever. Henry, worried, came into the room with a cup of tea for her. "You need to rest, Natalie. All this pressure isn't good for you," he said, placing the cup on the table and sitting beside her. Natalie smiled slightly, but it was a tired smile. "I know, Henry, but it's hard. Knowing that Victoria did all that, knowing that my own daughter betrayed me, it hurts so much." Suddenly she placed her hand on her chest, and her face twisted in pain. "Henry, I'm feeling a sharp pain here." Henry jumped up, his heart racing. "Natalie, what's happening? Are you okay?" She tried to respond, but her breathing was labored, and her eyes showed deep fear. "No. I think something's wrong." Without wasting time, Henry grabbed the phone and called an ambulance. Time seemed to crawl as he held Natalie's hand, trying to calm her. "Hold on, my love. Help is on the way." Minutes later, the ambulance arrived, and the paramedics quickly entered the house. They placed Natalie on a stretcher, and Henry stayed by her side the whole time, holding her hand as they rushed her to the hospital. At the hospital, the situation was serious. The doctors confirmed that Natalie had suffered a heart attack, and Henry was called to speak with one of the doctors about treatment options. "Mr. Henry," the doctor said with a serious expression, "your wife's condition is delicate. We'll need to act quickly. There's a procedure that could help stabilize her heart, but it comes with risks." Henry stood still, looking at the doctor, feeling the weight of the decision on his shoulders. "What are the risks?" he asked in a low voice, trying to stay calm. "The procedure is invasive, and given her age and health condition, there could be complications. However, if we do nothing, her condition could worsen quickly." Henry closed his eyes for a moment, trying to think clearly. He knew Natalie was fragile, and the last thing he wanted was to risk losing the person he loved most. But he also knew she was a fighter, always overcoming difficulties. He remembered all the promises he had made to her, to care for and protect her. Now he had to decide what was best, even if it was the hardest choice of his life. "We have to try. She's strong. She'll get through this," he said, his voice firm. The doctor nodded and went to prepare for the procedure, leaving Henry alone in the waiting room. As he waited, all he could do was think about Natalie, about all the memories they had built together, and pray that she could win this battle too. Days after Natalie's heart attack, Henry was still at the hospital, always by her side. She was recovering slowly, but each small step was a victory. While she rested, Henry couldn't stop thinking about how everything had come to this. The sale of the house, Natalie's abandonment, the betrayal by their daughters. There was something more behind all of it. He could feel it. Determined to uncover the full truth, Henry spent hours reviewing the documents from the house sale. He already knew that Natalie had been manipulated, but something in the paperwork didn't make sense. He decided to seek help from a family friend who was an accountant with experience in investigating financial fraud. Together, they began to comb through every detail of the transaction. After days of careful analysis, the accountant called Henry for a meeting. "Henry, I found something very strange here. Part of the money from the house sale isn't where it should be." Henry frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" The accountant showed him the documents pointing to some bank transfers. The money was distributed into several accounts, as expected, but a significant portion was transferred to foreign accounts in a country where it's hard to trace transactions, and those accounts are in Victoria's name. Henry was silent for a few seconds, processing what he had just heard. Victoria. So she didn't just manipulate her mother into selling the house, she also diverted part of the money abroad. "Exactly," replied the accountant. "She planned everything. She moved the money into foreign accounts to make it harder for anyone to find out. It's as if she was already preparing to flee with most of the inheritance." Henry's anger grew with every word. He knew Victoria had acted selfishly, but he hadn't imagined she would go this far. Manipulating her own mother was bad enough, but stealing the money from the house sale and hiding it in foreign accounts was an even dirtier move than he had thought. That explains how she kept living in all that luxury, even after everything fell apart here, Henry murmured, deep in thought. Yes, she was probably spending the money she siphoned off from the sale. The problem is, with the money in foreign accounts, it's going to be difficult to recover it without a deeper investigation and international legal help, the accountant explained. Henry felt a tightness in his chest. He knew he was facing a long battle, but he was determined to confront Victoria and undo what she had done. "I'm going after her. I won't let her get away with this after everything she did to Natalie and our family." He thanked the accountant for his help and left the room determined. Eleanor stood in front of the hospital door, her heart heavy and hands trembling. For days she knew she needed to visit her mother, but fear had kept her from taking that step. The guilt followed her wherever she went, and now, with Henry back and investigating everything, the pressure was even greater. She could no longer run. She had to face her parents. Eleanor entered the hospital and walked down the hallway to Natalie's room. When she reached the door, she saw her mother lying in bed, still fragile but with a peaceful expression. Henry sat beside her, holding her hand. It was a scene that should have brought comfort, but for Eleanor, it only brought more pain. She knocked lightly on the door, catching both their attention. Henry's face grew serious when he saw her, and Natalie gave a small smile. "Eleanor, my daughter," Natalie said softly. Eleanor tried to smile, but her nervousness was clear on her face. "Hi, Mum. Dad." Henry looked at her for a few seconds before responding. "You took your time to come, Eleanor." She took a deep breath and stepped further into the room, feeling the weight of her father's words. I was scared." Natalie gestured for her to come closer. "Scared of what, dear?" Eleanor sat in the chair beside Henry, but she couldn't meet their eyes. Her heart was racing. She wanted to tell the truth, to explain what had happened, but the words wouldn't come. The fear of disappointing her parents even more paralyzed her, and worse, she knew that the longer she stayed silent, the harder it would be to explain. I should have done something sooner," she began, her voice trembling. "I knew about some things, about Victoria. I just couldn't do anything." Henry frowned but said nothing. He knew there was more behind Eleanor's words, but he wanted to hear it all. "I saw what was happening," Eleanor continued, her voice quieter. "I knew she was manipulating Mum. I knew the papers she had Mum sign weren't for the renovations, but I didn't do anything. I just pulled away." Natalie looked at her daughter with sadness and compassion. "Eleanor, why didn't you tell us?" Eleanor lowered her head, ashamed. "I was scared, Mum, scared of Victoria, scared of how things would turn out. I stayed quiet, hoping someone else would fix it, but nothing happened. I distanced myself and let things get worse." Henry, though furious inside, kept his calm. He knew that as painful as Eleanor's confession was, she was trying to make amends. "You may have made mistakes, Eleanor," he said, "but you still have a chance to make things right. The truth always comes out." As Eleanor tried to deal with her guilt, Victoria, elsewhere, was busy thinking of how to escape the consequences of her actions. She knew Henry was investigating the money and that her situation was getting worse by the day. But even so, she wasn't giving up. In her mind, there was still a way to manipulate the situation in her favor. Victoria decided to make one more bold move. She would approach Henry again, not to apologize or make amends, but to try to win back his trust. "Maybe he still has some affection for me. After all, I was his daughter for so many years," she thought. "If I can get close to him again, maybe I can get more money. And who knows, escape from this mess." Her plan was simple: convince Henry that she was sorry, gain his forgiveness, and slowly try to siphon more money. She knew she couldn't undo what she had done, but she believed she could still find a way out, as she always had. Meanwhile, in the hospital, Eleanor looked at her parents with tears in her eyes. "I'll do whatever it takes to help now," she said, her voice trembling. "I know it's late, but I want to be part of the solution, not the problem." Henry looked at her seriously. "We're going to uncover the whole truth, Eleanor, and you're going to have to decide which side you're on." Henry was increasingly immersed in the investigations about what had happened to Natalie and the sale of the house. He knew Victoria was the main culprit, but something still bothered him. There were too many details that didn't add up, and it seemed impossible that Victoria had done everything alone. Then one day, while reviewing more documents and bank statements, Henry found a clue that shocked him. He realized that some of the money transfers, the ones to foreign accounts, were linked to the name of Noah, Victoria's ex-husband. At first, Henry thought it was just a coincidence, but as he dug deeper, it became clear. Noah was involved in everything. Henry stood up from the table in anger. "I knew he couldn't be trusted, but to manipulate Natalie along with Victoria, this goes beyond what I imagined." Determined to confront Noah, Henry called him. "Noah, I need to talk to you, now." Noah, on the other end of the line, hesitated but agreed. "Sure, Henry, what's going on?" Shortly after, they met in a quiet cafe, away from prying eyes. Henry didn't waste any time. "Noah, you were involved in the plan to manipulate Natalie, weren't you? I've already found the transfers to your accounts. I want to hear the truth from you." Noah tried to stay calm, but it was clear he hadn't expected Henry to get this far in his investigation. I was just helping Victoria. She said she was solving family problems. I didn't know things would get this bad," he said. Henry stared at him with pure fury. "You manipulated my wife, Victoria's mother, and threw her out on the streets. Don't give me excuses, Noah. You were with Victoria the whole time. She couldn't have done this alone." Noah took a deep breath, realizing he couldn't escape the truth any longer. "Okay, I admit it. I helped Victoria. We needed the money. She told me it would be easy, that Natalie wouldn't notice anything. I just wanted to make sure we had a stable future, Henry. I didn't know things would spiral out of control like this." Henry slammed his hand on the table, drawing the attention of a few people around them. "You wanted a stable future, and for that, you destroyed my wife's. Did you and Victoria ever think about the consequences? Did you ever think about what this would do to Natalie?" Noah lowered his head, unable to meet Henry's eyes. He knew there was no excuse for what he had done. "I made a mistake, Henry. I see that now. But please, give me a chance to make things right. We can find a way to fix this without hurting your family anymore." Henry stood up from the table, his voice low but filled with determination. "The only way to fix this is with the truth, and you and Victoria are going to face the consequences of what you've done. There's no escaping this, Noah. I won't let it go." Noah knew his attempts to justify himself wouldn't change anything. He was deeply involved in Victoria's scheme, and now Henry knew everything. Henry left the cafe without looking back, determined to expose the whole truth, no matter the cost. As Henry continued his investigations, he came across something unexpected. In an old box stored in the attic of the family home, he found a series of yellowed letters, carefully tied with a piece of twine. At first, he thought they were just old keepsakes, but when he opened the first letter, he realized the content was much darker than any memory. The letters were exchanges between Victoria's biological father, a man Henry had never known well, and some mysterious people involved in shady business. The more Henry read, the more horror filled his heart. Victoria's father was deeply involved in a network of corruption, which included blackmail and threats. And the most shocking discovery, Eleanor, Henry's own biological daughter, had been one of the victims of this blackmail. In one of the letters, Victoria's biological father mentioned Eleanor by name. He threatened to expose something about her, forcing her to stay silent and not interfere with Victoria's plans. "If she opens her mouth, we know exactly what to do with her. Eleanor has a lot to lose and she knows it," one of the letters said, making it clear how much pressure Eleanor was under. Henry was frozen as he read those words. Now he understood why Eleanor had stayed silent for so long. She wasn't just afraid of Victoria, she had been blackmailed, threatened in a way he had never imagined. Eleanor had been forced to remain quiet, to let things happen, to protect her own life and possibly her mother's. As Henry read further into the letters, he discovered another shocking detail. Victoria, despite knowing her biological father's criminal involvement, had continued sending him money. She had been funding his schemes, sending large sums of money, likely from the funds taken from the sale of Natalie's house. "She knew everything," Henry murmured in disbelief. Victoria was helping her biological father continue his crimes, and on top of that, she threatened Eleanor to make sure she stayed silent. Henry's heart sank as he realized the full truth. Not only had Victoria manipulated and betrayed the family, but she was involved in something much bigger. And Eleanor, the daughter he thought had simply distanced herself by choice, had been suffering in silence, blackmailed and threatened by people who should have protected her. With the letters in hand, Henry knew the situation had reached a point of no return. He could no longer just resolve the issue of the house. This involved far more serious crimes. He needed to expose everything, not only to protect his family, but to ensure justice was served. But above all, Henry now understood why Eleanor had never been able to tell the truth. She had been terrified, living under a shadow of fear and threats that he could never have imagined. He knew the next conversation with Eleanor would be difficult, but she needed to know that he was by her side, and that together They would expose all the secrets and put an end to this web of lies and corruption. With the letters in hand, Henry was ready to face the most painful truth of his life. But now he had the proof he needed, and he wouldn't rest until Victoria and everyone involved paid for their crimes. Grabbing the papers he had found, he quickly left the house, his heart racing, trying to imagine how Eleanor would react when she found out he had discovered everything. When he arrived at Eleanor's small apartment, he knocked on the door forcefully. She opened a few seconds later, surprised to see her father there, but something in her expression showed that she knew why he had come. "Eleanor, we need to talk, now." She stepped back, letting Henry in. She closed the door slowly, already feeling the weight of the conversation to come. "What's going on, Dad?" Henry held up the bundle of letters and placed them on the table in front of her. "I found this. Letters from Victoria's biological father. He was blackmailing you, wasn't he? And Victoria, she knew everything. She was sending him money. I know you stayed quiet out of fear, but I need to hear the truth from you." Eleanor turned pale, her eyes wide with fear. She tried to speak, but her voice failed at first. Taking a deep breath, she finally managed to get the words out. "Yes, Dad. I was scared. He threatened to expose me, threatened our family, threatened Mum. He had pictures of her and threatened her life. He said if I said anything, something bad would happen. I didn't know what to do. So I stayed away, thinking it was the only way to protect you." Henry looked at her with sadness, realizing how much Eleanor had been carrying alone. "You didn't have to face this alone, Eleanor. I should have been there for you." Suddenly, a noise from outside interrupted the conversation. It was the sound of hurried footsteps in the hallway, as if someone was coming directly towards the apartment. Henry and Eleanor exchanged worried glances, fear evident in both their eyes. "Dad, I think it's him," Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling. Before they could react, the door was kicked open, and a tall man with a threatening expression stormed into the apartment. His eyes were cold, and he had something hidden in his jacket, clearly armed. It was the same man who had been behind the threats sent by Victoria's biological father to retrieve the incriminating letters. "I know you have the letters," the man said in a low, firm voice. "Hand them over now, and no one gets hurt." Henry stepped forward, instinctively shielding Eleanor. "You're not laying a hand on my daughter. The letters are here, but you'll have to get through me before you touch them." The man laughed, a cruel, emotionless sound. "You think you can stop me? This ends how I say it does." Eleanor was frozen with fear, but seeing her father's courage, something ignited inside her. She couldn't let this go on. Quickly, she grabbed her phone and discreetly sent a message to the neighbors' group chat, while the man continued staring down Henry. Henry, keeping his calm, spoke firmly. "You think this will fix anything? The truth is already out. Even if you take the letters, people already know what happened. You won't get away with this." The man moved closer, but before he could act, loud voices erupted behind him, and police sirens began echoing outside. He glanced towards the window, realizing his time was up. "Damn," he muttered, turning to try and escape. But it was too late. The police were already in the building, and he was quickly surrounded by neighbors before he could flee. As the officers took the man away, Eleanor began to cry, feeling the relief and the weight of everything she had endured finally lift off her. Henry pulled her into a tight embrace, trying to comfort her. "It's all right now, Eleanor, it's over. You're safe." She looked up at her father, her eyes still filled with tears. "I'm so sorry for not telling you earlier, Dad. I was so scared." Henry cupped her face with his hands, looking deeply into her eyes. "You did what you thought was right at the time, but now together we'll fix everything. You're not alone anymore." For the first time in a long while, Eleanor felt like she could finally begin to let go of the fear and guilt that had held her back for so long. With the unfolding of these events and the evidence in hand, Henry knew he needed help to deal with the web of corruption that had entangled his family. That's when he sought out Detective Grayson, a respected and experienced investigator, known for never giving up on a case until the full truth was revealed. Grayson was a serious man of few words, but his determination and skill in solving mysteries were undeniable. When Henry entered his office with all the letters, documents, and information, about the corruption involving Victoria and her biological father, Grayson immediately took the case. "These people have gone too far, Henry. I'll help you put an end to this once and for all," Grayson said, carefully analyzing the evidence. As Grayson dug deeper into the case, Natalie remained in the hospital, still fragile but growing stronger each day. Henry spent as much time by her side as possible, updating her on the progress Grayson was making. He knew Natalie wanted to see justice, and knowing their family might finally have peace was what kept her fighting. "Henry, do you think this will all end well?" Natalie asked, her voice soft as she rested in her hospital bed. Henry held her hand, his gaze firm. "It will, Natalie. Grayson is piecing everything together. He's good at what he does. We'll clear our family's name and put an end to all of this." In the following days, Grayson began uncovering even more disturbing details. He traced the foreign accounts where Victoria had transferred the money from the house sale and found clear evidence that her biological father had been involved in illegal schemes for a long time, using blackmail and corruption to grow his wealth. Grayson also discovered that it wasn't just Eleanor who had been threatened. Other people who had done business with Victoria and her father were also under pressure to stay silent. He interviewed former associates and began building a solid case, linking all the pieces of the plot. "They created a corruption network that goes deeper than we imagined, Henry," Grayson explained during a visit to Henry's house. "But don't worry, we have enough evidence to take them all down." Henry listened intently, knowing that Grayson's work was close to revealing the full truth. "And Victoria? What will happen to her?" he asked, still trying to come to terms with the fact that his adopted daughter had been so deeply involved in this scheme. Grayson looked at Henry, his expression firm. "She'll be held accountable. There's no escaping the consequences now. She committed serious crimes, and with the evidence we have, she won't be able to walk away from this. Her biological father will also be imprisoned." Meanwhile, in the hospital, Natalie continued to improve. Though the doctors said her recovery would be slow, the support from Henry and the progress in the case gave her the strength she needed to keep going. During Henry's visits, he always brought good news which filled her with hope. "Grayson is close to solving everything, Natalie. We're going to get our justice," Henry said with an encouraging smile. Natalie, still weak, smiled back. "I just want all of this to end, Henry. I want our family to have peace again." Grayson's work was nearly complete. He gathered all the evidence and presented the case to the authorities. The corruption network involving Victoria's father and his partners began to crumble, and those who had been blackmailed, like Eleanor, were finally free from the threats that had kept them silent. In a final meeting with Henry, Grayson delivered the news everyone had been waiting for. "We did it, Henry. Victoria, her biological father, and everyone involved are being officially investigated. They'll pay for everything they did, and the money that was stolen will be recovered." Henry felt a deep sense of relief, as if a huge weight had been lifted off his shoulders. "Thank you, Grayson. I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done for us." Grayson gave a small smile. "I'm just doing my job. The most important thing is that your family can begin to heal now." The night was calm at the hospital, and Henry sat beside Natalie as he did every day since she had been admitted. She was sleeping, and he used the quiet to reflect on everything that had happened. Despite all the chaos, it seemed like things were finally being resolved. Grayson's investigation was complete, the evidence was in the hands of the authorities, and the end of the corruption scheme was near. But outside, something dangerous was about to happen. Noah, desperate after learning that the incriminating letters were with Henry and Grayson, decided to take drastic action. He knew that if those letters reached the authorities, not only would Victoria be punished, but he would also go to jail for his involvement. He wasn't willing to let that happen. Noah headed to the hospital, his face tense, with a clear plan in mind: to kidnap Natalie and use her as leverage. If he could take her, he could force Henry to hand over the letters in exchange for his wife's safety. He believed this was his only chance to escape the consequences. When Noah arrived at the hospital, he entered discreetly, pretending to be just another visitor. He knew he had to act quickly, so he went straight to Natalie's room. When he reached the door, he looked around to make sure no one was watching. Taking a deep breath, he slowly opened the door and entered. Henry, sitting beside Natalie, noticed a shadow moving near the entrance. When he looked up, he found himself face to face with Noah. "What are you doing here?" Henry asked, standing up immediately, his body tense with worry. Noah closed the door behind him and took a few steps into the room. "You know what I want, Henry. The letters. Hand them over now, or your wife will suffer the consequences." Henry's heart raced. He knew Noah was serious, but even so, he didn't back down. "You think you're going to leave here with her? The police are already after you, Noah. You won't get far." Noah glanced at Natalie, who was slowly waking up, still confused by what was happening. "I have nothing to lose, Henry. If you don't give me what I want, I'll take Natalie right now, and don't think I'm bluffing." Before Noah could move any closer, Natalie finally realized what was happening. "Noah, why are you doing this?" she asked weakly, still dazed by the situation. "I don't have a choice, Natalie," Noah replied, trying to sound cold. "Those letters need to disappear. They'll ruin me, they'll ruin Victoria, and I won't let that happen. So, listen to me. Either Henry gives me the letters, or I take you." Henry stepped forward, shielding Natalie. "You've never had the courage to face the consequences, Noah, but that ends today." Before Noah could react, the door to the room was flung open and police officers entered. Grayson was with them, gun drawn, ready to act. "It's over, Noah," Grayson said firmly. "Put your hands where I can see them." Noah froze for a moment, looking from Henry to the police officers. Knowing he was cornered, he slowly raised his hands, his face showing defeat. "Damn it," he muttered as the police approached to handcuff him. "You think this will fix anything, Henry?" Noah said in one last effort to provoke. "You think arresting me and Victoria will make everything that happened disappear?" Henry stood firm, looking directly into Noah's eyes. "It won't erase what happened, but it will make sure you never hurt anyone again." The police led Noah out of the room, and silence returned once more. Henry turned to Natalie, who was still a bit shaken but relieved to be safe. He sat down next to her and held her hand. "Are you all right, Natalie?" he asked, his eyes filled with concern. She took a deep breath and nodded. "Yes, Henry. I'm fine now. It was terrifying, but I'm okay because you were here." Henry sighed, feeling the relief finally wash over him. "It's over now. They won't touch you again." Days after the kidnapping attempt, Henry and Eleanor were sitting in the hospital, in the same room where Natalie was recovering. The atmosphere was calm, but the silence between father and daughter was heavy. Eleanor knew that, sooner or later, she would have to tell the truth about everything that had happened. She needed to get the weight off her shoulders and explain what had really caused her to pull away and stay silent when her mother needed her most. Henry looked at Eleanor, seeing the anguish on her face. He knew there was more to her story, that things weren't as simple as they seemed. "Eleanor, you've been so quiet. I know there's something more to this. It's time for you to tell me what really happened." Eleanor took a deep breath, her heart heavy. The words were stuck in her throat, but she knew she couldn't hide the truth any longer. With a trembling voice, she began to speak. "Dad, I wasn't just passive. I wanted to help. I wanted to tell you everything, but they threatened me." Henry looked at her, worried. "Who threatened you, Eleanor? What are you talking about?" She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to control the tears that were beginning to fall. Victoria and her biological father. They were behind everything from the start. When I found out what they were doing to Mum, I tried to intervene. I tried to talk to them, but that's when they started manipulating and threatening me. Henry remained silent, already aware of some of what he was hearing. He knew Victoria had been involved, but not to this extent. "What did they do to you, Eleanor?" She stared at the floor, avoiding her father's eyes, the guilt evident on her face. "They told me that if I tried to stop them or told you, they'd hurt Mum. They knew where she was all the time, knew you were away, and they used that against me. Victoria was cold, Dad. She told me that if I said anything, Mum would suffer." Henry felt a wave of anger and sadness wash over him. "You were scared they'd hurt your mother?" Eleanor nodded, tears finally streaming down her face. "Yes, I was terrified. I didn't know what to do. They pressured me, Dad. I was trapped, and every time I thought about telling the truth, Victoria's and her father's threats echoed in my head. I froze. I know I should have done something, but the fear was too much." Henry took a deep breath, stood up, and walked over to her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I'm so sorry you went through that alone, Eleanor. But you should have trusted me. You should have told me the truth sooner," Eleanor sobbed, trying to speak, but the words barely came out. "I know, Dad, I should have told you, but I was so scared of losing Mum. I couldn't think straight." Henry pulled her into a tight hug, letting her release her emotions. "You're not alone anymore, Eleanor. The manipulation is over. They won't hurt us again." Natalie, who had been lying in bed listening to the conversation, opened her eyes and spoke weakly. "Eleanor, I will never blame you for being afraid. You always wanted to protect our family. I know you did the best you could at the time." Eleanor moved closer to her mother's bed, gently taking her hand. "I'm sorry, Mum. I'm sorry I wasn't stronger." Natalie smiled, despite her weakness, and squeezed her daughter's hand. "The important thing is that we're together now, and nothing and no one will separate us again." Henry looked at the two of them, feeling both relief and sorrow. He knew that the truth had finally come out, and although there was still much to resolve, Eleanor's confession was a crucial step toward the family's healing. "Now that everything is exposed, we can move forward. Together," Henry said, looking at his wife and daughter. Eleanor wiped away her tears, still emotional but relieved to have finally told the truth. The fear that had held her back for so long was beginning to fade, and she knew that, with the support of her parents, she could rebuild her relationship with them. "Yes, Dad, together," she replied with a small smile, feeling that for the first time in a long time things could get better. As the days passed, Natalie continued to recover in the hospital. Though her body was still weak, her mind was clear. She knew that despite everything that had happened, there was still one secret she could no longer keep. It was time to tell the truth, to reveal something she had hidden for a long time to protect her family. One morning, as Henry and Eleanor sat beside her in the hospital room, talking about the future and how they would rebuild their lives, Natalie, with a serious expression, looked at them and decided it was time. "Henry's Eleanor, I need to tell you something important. Something I've kept hidden all this time," she began, her voice soft but firm. Henry frowned, confused. "What is it, Natalie? What are you trying to say?" Eleanor looked at her mother anxiously. "Mum, what's going on? You can tell us." Natalie took a deep breath, closing her eyes for a moment, as if gathering all the courage needed to say what she had to. "All this time, while you were investigating what Victoria and her father were doing, there was something I knew, something I hid." Henry and Eleanor exchanged surprised looks, not knowing what to expect. "What did you hide, Natalie?" Henry asked, moving closer to the bed. Natalie opened her eyes and looked directly at them. The letters that incriminate Victoria and her father. I hid them." Shock washed over Henry and Eleanor. "You knew about the letters all along?" Henry asked in disbelief. Natalie nodded slightly. "Yes, I knew. When I realized what was happening and how Victoria and her father were manipulating everything, I managed to find those letters before they could do anything worse. I knew that if they fell into the wrong hands it could be dangerous, so I hid them in secret." Eleanor, still stunned, asked, "Why, Mum, why didn't you tell us before?" Natalie looked at her daughter lovingly. "I did it to protect you both. We were being threatened from all sides, and I knew that if those letters were exposed at that moment, it could put our family at even greater risk. I thought that by hiding them, I could buy us time to stop everything from falling apart." Henry felt a mix of relief and sadness as he heard Natalie's explanation. "You were protecting all of us, even while suffering so much." Natalie smiled, though her eyes showed her exhaustion. "Yes, Henry, I wanted to prevent more pain, but now, after everything that's happened, I know that hiding the truth won't help anymore. We need to expose these letters and let justice be done." Eleanor, with tears in her eyes, took her mother's hand. "Mum, you didn't have to carry that burden alone. I'm so sorry for everything. Now we can face this together." Natalie squeezed her daughter's hand tenderly. "I know, dear. And now it's time for us to face everything as a family. I won't hide anything anymore." Henry, his heart heavy, moved closer to the bed and placed his hand on Natalie's. "You did what you thought was right to protect the family, and I love you for that. But now you're right. We'll expose everything. These letters will bring down everything Victoria and her father built. Natalie took a deep breath, feeling relieved to have finally told the truth. The letters are hidden at home, Henry. We need to give them to Detective Grayson. With this revelation, Henry and Eleanor knew they were finally one step away from ending all the pain. With the letters in the hands of the authorities, justice would be served, and they could finally begin to rebuild their lives without any more secrets or threats. "We'll settle this, Natalie," Henry said with determination. "This time they won't escape." Eleanor wiped her tears and smiled at her mother. "We're going to be okay, Mum. Thank you for always protecting us." Days passed, and Detective Grayson's investigation, combined with the letters that Natalie revealed, finally brought the full truth to light about Victoria, Noah, and her biological father. With the evidence in hand, the authorities had no doubts about the crimes they had committed. The web of manipulation, blackmail, and corruption was fully exposed. It was only a matter of time before justice was served. One clear morning, Henry and Eleanor were sitting in the living room, anxiously waiting for the latest developments. Natalie, still recovering in the hospital, had been informed about the next steps, and they all knew this would be the end of the nightmare that Victoria and her father had created. Suddenly the phone rang. It was Grayson. Henry answered, his voice filled with anticipation. "Grayson, has something happened?" The detective's steady voice came through the line. "Henry, it's official. Victoria, Noah, and her biological father were sentenced this morning. The evidence you provided was enough to incriminate them. They will answer for all the crimes they committed." Henry felt a deep sense of relief wash over him. He looked at Eleanor, who was watching in silence, trying to understand what was happening. "They've been arrested, Eleanor. It's over. It's finally over." Eleanor covered her face with her hands, the weight of months of fear and uncertainty lifting all at once. "Dad, I don't even know how to react. I spent so much time being afraid, so much time not knowing what would happen. And now it's all over." Henry walked over to his daughter and hugged her tightly. "We made it, Eleanor. I know it was hard, but now we're free from the pain. We can move on." As they embraced, Grayson continued explaining the details. Victoria and Noah tried to deny everything, but the evidence was undeniable. The letters, the money transfers, and the testimonies of the people they blackmailed. There was no way out, and Victoria's biological father will also be prosecuted for his past crimes. Henry sighed, relieved but with a hint of sadness in his heart. "Grayson, I knew Victoria had lost her way, but I never imagined she would go this far. She was our daughter." Grayson, ever professional, responded with compassion. "I know it's hard, Henry, but she made choices that led her here. Now she has to face the consequences of those choices." After hanging up the phone, Henry and Eleanor sat in silence for a few minutes. The relief was palpable, but there was also sadness over what Victoria had become. Even though she was adopted, she had always been treated with the same love and care as Eleanor, but in the end, she had let greed and ambition consume her. "And now, Dad, what do we do?" Eleanor asked, still trying to process the end of this long journey. Henry took a deep breath and smiled slightly. "Now we take care of your mother. Go to the hospital and tell her that it's all over. She deserves to know that justice has been done. After that, we move forward as a family." When they arrived at the hospital, Natalie was sitting up in bed, stronger and more at peace than she had been in weeks. When she saw Henry and Eleanor enter, she smiled, already sensing they had good news. "I think you have good news for me," she said, with a twinkle in her eye. Henry walked over to the bed and held her hand. "Natalie, it's over. Victoria, Noah, and her father have been arrested. Grayson just called. Justice has been served." Natalie closed her eyes for a moment, as if absorbing the news. When she opened them again, tears of relief streamed down her face. "I've waited so long for this moment. Now we can finally breathe in peace, right?" Eleanor, emotional, moved closer to her mother and hugged her. "Yes, Mum. Now we can breathe in peace. We're free from all of it." The stormy days were finally behind them. There were no more secrets, threats, or manipulations. Now they had the chance to rebuild everything that had been destroyed, starting with the most important thing, being together. Natalie, still recovering, was finally discharged from the hospital. On the day she returned home, Henry and Eleanor were by her side, supporting her every step of the way. With life slowly returning to normal, Eleanor still felt that she needed to do something special for her mother. She knew that Natalie had always dreamed of returning to their old house, the place where so many memories had been made, and now, with the inheritance she had received from her grandfather, she had the chance to make that dream a reality. One morning, while they were having breakfast together, Eleanor decided it was time to share her plan with Henry. "Dad, there's something I want to talk to you about," she said, trying to contain her excitement. Henry looked at her curiously, setting his coffee cup down on the table. "What is it, dear? You sound like you've got something important to say." Eleanor took a deep breath, a shy smile forming on her lips. "I've been thinking, Mum has always loved our old house, the place where she lived for so many years. Now that everything's calmed down, I think it's time to do something special for her." Henry frowned, not quite understanding at first. "What are you planning, Eleanor?" She smiled more openly now. "I'm going to use Grandpa's inheritance. I'm going to buy Mum's house back. I want her to have that place again, the place that was always the heart of our family." Henry was silent for a moment, letting the surprise turn into pride. "Eleanor, that's amazing. Your mother will be so touched. Are you sure you want to do this?" Eleanor looked at her father with determination. "I'm sure, Dad. That money was left to me with love, and I can't think of a better way to use it than to give Mum back what was taken from her." In the days that followed, Eleanor carefully handled all the arrangements, keeping everything a secret from Natalie. She contacted the current owners, made an offer, and soon managed to buy the house back. The process was quick, and in no time, the house was in Natalie's name again. When everything was ready, Eleanor and Henry took Natalie to the house without explaining the reason for the visit. As they arrived, Natalie looked at the familiar facade, but didn't immediately understand what was happening. "Eleanor, why are we here?" Natalie asked, confused, looking at the house she had loved so much but no longer owned. Eleanor smiled, taking her mother's hands. "Mum, this house was always your home, our home, and now it's yours again." Natalie blinked, not believing what she was hearing. "What are you saying, Eleanor?" Eleanor took a deep breath, her heart pounding with emotion. "With Grandpa's inheritance, I bought the house back. It's yours, Mum. The place where you made so many memories, where you always wanted to be. It's back in your hands." Natalie brought her hands to her face, tears filling her eyes. "Eleanor, you did this for me?" Eleanor smiled, her own eyes filled with tears. "Yes, Mum. I did it for all of us, because this place is special, and you deserve to have it back." Henry, standing beside them, could barely contain his own emotions. "This place has always been our home, Natalie, and now it's yours again, thanks to our daughter." Natalie cried tears of joy, hugging Eleanor tightly. "I can't believe it. This is more than I could have dreamed of. Thank you, my dear. Thank you for giving me this happiness." "I can't believe I'm home again," Natalie said, her voice full of emotion as she crossed the threshold and felt the warmth of the house. "It feels like so long ago." Henry gently hugged her. "It's true, my love. But now we're together, and nothing will separate us again." Eleanor, her eyes brimming with happy tears, helped her mother sit on the sofa. "It's so good to have you back, Mum." Natalie looked around, taking in every detail of the house. Everything seemed more beautiful now, perhaps because she knew how much she had fought to be there, surrounded by her family. She took Henry's hand on one side and Eleanor's on the other, pulling them close. "We've been through so much," she began, her voice soft. "But the most important thing is that we're here, together. And that's all that matters now." Henry, holding their hands, nodded. Nothing was easy, but what kept me going was knowing that in the end, we would always have our family. That's what gives us strength. Eleanor smiled, finally feeling at peace. "I regret so many things, but I've learned that we can always start again, as long as there's love." They sat there, hand in silence for a few minutes, simply enjoying each other's company. The weight of everything they had gone through had lifted, and now they could move forward without fear. Later that day, Henry prepared dinner, something simple but made with love. Natalie and Eleanor laughed and talked in the living room, the sound of their laughter filling the air in a way Henry hadn't heard in a long time. As he cooked, he couldn't help but smile. The family was whole again, and that was all he had ever wanted. During dinner, as they sat together at the table, the atmosphere was light, full of stories and laughter. Eleanor talked about her future plans, how she wanted to start doing something she truly loved. Natalie, ever wise, supported her in every idea, and Henry, proud, listened attentively. "You're going to be amazing, Eleanor," Natalie said, smiling with pride. "Now that we're at peace, we can dream again." Eleanor looked at her mother and father, her heart full of gratitude. "And the best part is that I can do it with you both by my side." After dinner, as they cleaned up together, Henry looked at Natalie and Eleanor, feeling a simple, true happiness. They had faced a storm, but in the end, the love of their family had been stronger than any adversity. "Today has been the best day in a long time," Henry said, his eyes shining. "We're together, we're happy, and nothing can shake us anymore." Natalie smiled and hugged him. "It's just the beginning of a new chapter for us, a chapter full of love and hope." Eleanor joined the hug, completing the family circle. "Together, always," she said softly, but with certainty. In that moment, in the warmth of their home with laughter and love flowing between them, Henry, Natalie, and Eleanor knew that despite everything they had been through, they were stronger and closer than ever. And that was the greatest gift they could have. Please leave your comment with your thoughts on the story or what you learned. You might change someone's life with your words. Share it with that friend or family member who you think could learn an important lesson from it. At the end, I'll also leave a few more stories that I'm sure will change the way you see the world.